Eleanor and Cleopatra, Part 3. Family Matters. Last time, Cleopatra and Eleanor rode the wild waves of fate. Cleopatra went from potentially becoming the first Roman empress to a potential murder suspect in a matter of mere hours. Eleanor evaded several unwanted suitors before marrying Henry of Aquitaine, who then in turn became Henry II of England. Eleanor gave birth to a dizzying number of potential heirs, ensuring the newly cast Plantagenet dynasty would at least not wither on the vine. Henry fought the Welsh, the French king, and his own vassals. Now in this third installment, both women learn that family life and political life in the pre-modern age is essentially impossible to separate. Late March, 44 BCE. Cleopatra sails from Rome. Her lover and protector, Julius Caesar, was dead. The Roman world once more in chaos. Cleopatra had, many years earlier, made the decision to enter herself into Rome's favorite blood sport, politics. Now, as the mother to Julius Caesar's son, it was impossible to extricate herself. Sure, holding Caesarion gave her power, but it also made her an irresistible target. Unfortunately, as Cleopatra sails out of Rome, so she sails temporarily out of our view. Cleopatra is generally defined by her Roman counterparts, at least in the sources. Without a Roman male escort, the sources stop caring about her. Hence, there is less that we can say about Cleopatra between Caesar and Antony than we, certainly I, would like there to be. Now, it's unclear who managed Egyptian affairs while Cleopatra was absent, but whoever did so certainly did a good job. There's no evidence of protests or famine. The temples flourished, the Nile rose and fell. All was well. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra slipped effortlessly back into her role as Isis. The only bad news, well, other than the whole Caesar murdered thing, came out of Ephesus. There, Arisne, Cleopatra's sister, was once more agitating for the throne. Ephesus was a rich temple city, and Arisne likely had Roman backers as well. She was not to be ignored. It was around the time that Arisne rises in revolt that Cleopatra decides she's just, kind of had it with the whole family thing. That summer, 44 BCE, she poisoned her brother Pharaoh, Ptolemy XIV. For the first time then, in 44 BCE, Caesarion is named Pharaoh. Now, I don't want to confuse you. This move changes nothing politically. Cleopatra was already ruling through her son. Her reason for murdering her brother had nothing to do with anything that he was doing politically. She just didn't want to take the chance that someone might use him someday as a puppet. Cleopatra is just as in charge in July 44 BCE as she had been in June. If anything, she returned from Rome more godly, completely embracing her role as the goddess Isis. If anything, Caesar's death made her more mystically powerful in the eyes of her subjects. She was now the wife of a deceased god. Caesar would be deified on January 1st, 42 BCE. She was the wife of a martyr. Upon her return, Cleopatra embarked on an ambitious building project. She built new temples at Luxor. Unfortunately, her most impressive building site was just above the Alexandrian harbor, and no longer exists. It was dedicated to Caesar. The Caesarion, as it was known, is now entirely underwater today and lost to us. She also returned to more cultural endeavors, surrounding herself with Greek thinkers and writers. scholarly work in grammar and history enjoyed a renaissance. The biggest intellectual jumps came in the field of medicine. Influential doctors wrote prolifically during Cleopatra's reign, and they did not solely regurgitate the pointless witticisms of the past. These doctors were actually doing new work, particularly in the field of surgery. Cleopatra's Egypt made massive strides. Cleopatra supported and engaged in these endeavors to the benefit of her image and her people. The reason that Cleopatra's court became such a fount of new knowledge was because of her proximity to the East, where new ideas were beginning to take hold. To the east of Alexandria, people knew Cleopatra's name, but not only as Caesar's lover, as was the case in the Roman world. To the east, Cleopatra was a philosopher, and some believed a magician. She needed that image in the following 2 years, because Egypt, it needed a little magic. In 44 and 43 BCE, the Nile did not rise at all, leading to first starvation, and then, because Cleopatra devalued the currency further, runaway inflation. Having little choice, Cleopatra opened the royal granaries that fed her people and issued general tax amnesties. And the timing wasn't good, because in 43 BCE, the Roman Civil War came back to Egypt's shores. The heirs of Caesar, Antony, his nephew Octavian, and another of Caesar's subordinates, Dolabella, fought against the assassins who clustered around Brutus and Cassius. The best thing for Cleopatra to do was to be neutral. So this she tried until she could no longer. Then she threw in with Dolabella, who was currently engaged with Cassius in the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra sent Dolabella the 4 legions that she had left from Caesar and a large fleet. Unfortunately, Cleopatra's fleet was intercepted on the high seas. Without a struggle, it defected to Cassius, Dolabella's rival and one of the leading assassins. In turn, Cassius now came and tried to prevail upon Cleopatra for her assistance. She sent excuses. Oh, there's a plague. Oh, there's a famine. She was utterly without resources. She couldn't send anything. However, simultaneously, in secret, she prepared to send a second expedition to Dolabella. Foul winds unfortunately confined that fleet to the harbor. And she also met with rebellious subordinates. Her military commander in Cyprus countermanded her orders and decided to side with Cassius and supply him with Egyptian ships. Cleopatra, unfortunately, would be stuck having to answer for that subordinate later on. Now, Cleopatra was playing a dangerous game here, and she knew it. In July of 43, Cassius's army encircled and crushed Dolabella, who then committed suicide. If she had not already heard, Cleopatra then received word from Cassius's other enemies, Octavian and Antony. Those two were finally in league at the end of 43, intent on revenge against the assassins. For Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and his formal council, Cleopatra readied another, third fleet, loaded down with materials. She intended this time to deliver it personally to Greece. But meanwhile, Cassius was still there, menacing her. She refused to rise to the bait. He threatened Egypt again. He had only asked for her cooperation. Cleopatra had instead assisted his enemy. She was by no means, by the way, at this point, providing and pretending to be the obedient female that she was supposed to be. Now enraged at this point, Cassius prepares a full-scale Egyptian invasion. His timing would have been perfect. Egypt was weak with famine. Cleopatra had sent away the 4 Roman legions that were now decimated. However, Cleopatra later would insist that she, quote, had not been terrified of Cassius, end quote. But anybody would have been, and she would have been foolish not to be. He was a terrible character from history, At least from what we get, composed of equal parts cruelty and greed, he was known as an aggressive man and had been one of the prime movers of the assassin. He was not going to spare Caesarion. There was no chance. He also had 12 first-rate legions at his command. He had been pitiless with those cities, which he had already marched into. And don't forget, and we never talk about this sometimes in the Roman sources, but Cassius was a skilled Roman general. He had way more resources. Cleopatra on her own would not be able to stand against him. Yet Cleopatra was spared in the nick of time by competing Roman interests. As Cassius began his march into Egypt, he was diverted by an urgent summons because Antony and Octavian had crossed the Adriatic. They traveled east to challenge him. Cassius, we're told, actually hesitated because Egypt was such a rich prize. But Brutus reminded him that they were not meant to win power, but liberty for the country. So Cassius, disappointed, reversed direction to join Brutus in Greece. For Cleopatra, the reprieve coincided with other unhappy events, unfortunately. She headed out with her fleet to join Antony and Octavian, but foul weather intervened. She had to return to Alexandria, disappointed. Now, Cleopatra was trying to be true to her word. She was trying to help Antony and Octavian. Just turns out that weather intervened. However, having offered the victors, because by this point Antony and Octavian had triumphed over the assassins, she had offered them no effective assistance, and Cleopatra knew that she would be held to account soon enough. Sure enough, an emissary arrived in Alexandria, more or less on cue, probably in early 41 BCE. He was a suave negotiator, a man of acrobatic loyalties. Quintus Dellius had changed sides already, 3 times in the course of the Civil War. Dellius now came as an emissary for Mark Antony, and he seems to have realized almost immediately that Antony and Cleopatra would make a perfect match. Cleopatra must, Dellius told her, come with him and make haste to see Antony. She had nothing to fear. Antony was, quote, the gentlest and kindest of soldiers. Now, as I mentioned before, much had transpired since Cleopatra left Rome. So let's do a quick recap. By November of 43 BCE, Octavian and Antony had joined their forces. They previously had other options. Brutus and Cassius leading the group that I guess I'll classify as Republicans or assassins, they get called both, were now united in the eastern Mediterranean. Brutus and Cassius were well funded and well armed, giving Octavian and Antony no choice but to set aside their many differences. Together with General Lepidus, those two formed the Second Triumvirate in January 42 BCE. Each was appointed dictator for 5 years. Each received a sphere of influence. Roughly speaking, Octavian got the West, Lepidus North Africa, and Antony the East. Roughly speaking, Cleopatra would have been relieved, but as we talked about before, Cassius now had her in his crosshairs. But together, Antony and Octavian, and I'm not going to bother mentioning Lepidus, because most histories ignore him, stood a chance against Brutus and Cassius. The triumvirate agreement gave Antony and Octavian unity, but it didn't give money. The wealth of the East was still being siphoned off by Brutus and Cassius. So how to get money? The triumvirs settled on another tried and true Roman solution: prescription. You come up with a list of names, said men can be legally killed, and their property seized. Cha-ching! Your odds of survival suddenly went down with the amount of money that you had. That state of affairs led inevitably to the sticky subject of personal enemies. The 3 men, Octavian, Antony, Lepidus, withdrew and compiled lists in private. There was some high-level horse trading, as they offered up, quote, their staunchest friends in return for their bitterest enemies, end quote. In such a way, Antony sacrificed a much-loved uncle for Cicero. Lepidus threw over his brother. Quote, extra names were constantly added to the list, some from enmity, others because they had been a nuisance or were friends of enemies, or enemies of friends, or, as most often the case, were notably wealthy, end quote. In the end, over 2,000 wealthy Romans lay dead, victims to the cold necessity of economics. One such victim, Cicero. Antony and Cicero hated each other, and so Antony made sure that the orator found his way onto the prescription lists. Cicero had actually not gone with Brutus and Cassius, and remained in Rome. However, by December 43, at his villa in south of Rome. On December the 7th, Antony's men found him. His servants begged the old Republican to flee, and he consented, but too late. He was stopped on the road, and there the assassin severed Cicero's head and hands. Antony made a spectacle of the hands, which had been used so recently to write against him. Sadly, all these prescriptions did not yield the wealth Antony and Octavian expected, leaving them the masters of 43 legions and dead broke. But the war must go on. So around midsummer 43, the armies of Antony and Octavian met those of Brutus and Cassius in Greece. The battle featured over 100,000 legionnaires who fought with the same weapons and tactics. The battle was actually 2 days in length, with a pause in between. Only on the second day did Antony prevail. Octavian was ill, as he often was, and did not participate in the battle. Both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide, and the republican cause of Rome was lost forever. Once more, Antony and Octavian divided the world between them, but this time they dispensed with Lepidus altogether. Again, the division was roughly east-west. Antony got the east, Octavian the west. Antony's goal was to reorganize the east and direct a campaign against the Parthians. Octavian, if he ever returned to health, was to demobilize his legions and distribute way overdue lands for their service. In hindsight, it's easy to see why the civil war would continue. Octavian and Antony were diametrically opposed. Yet, even at the time, everyone seems to have known even this was only a band-aid, a temporary lull in the fighting. Had the Civil War ended in 43 BCE, however, we would probably never hear of Cleopatra again. But fate and history were not done with the Egyptian queen yet. So that brings us up to speed, as Dellius shows up and quickly carts Cleopatra off to meet with Mark Antony. Dellius tried to get Cleopatra to Antony as quickly as he could, but Cleopatra was determined to delay the meeting. The reason was obvious. She had to explain herself. She had attempted to help Dolabella, but the aid, and this wasn't her fault, again it was the governor of Cyprus, but the aid actually went to her former lover's murders. Moreover, after the defeat of Brutus and Cassius, Cleopatra remained silent. Was she going back to Rome? Was Egypt to remain a protectorate? Rome demanded answers to these questions, and it was Antony who needed to get said answers. He was the master of the East, so Egypt fell under his purview. Antony had come east and installed himself in Tarsus, the administrative capital of Cilicia, on the southeastern coast of modern-day Turkey. So Cleopatra went to see Antony there, and she left nothing to chance. Antony had received elaborate welcomes across Asia. Cleopatra wanted to make sure that her first audience would top them all. Her barge that traveled down the river Tarsus had on it a golden stern and flowing purple sails. Her oars were made of silver. Word traveled quickly. As Cleopatra approached the city proper, people literally streamed out to see her. In fact, according to our sources, so many people came out to see Cleopatra that Antony, who had been conducting affairs in the marketplace, suddenly found himself alone. Everything about her approach had been tailored specifically to what Cleopatra knew that Antony liked. This means she certainly knew the man. Very likely they had crossed paths in Rome during one of her 2 visits, especially given her close proximity to Caesar. She knew Antony to be politically astute and utterly reckless at other times. Antony ultimately came out to greet the Egyptian queen as well. He then invited her to dinner, an invitation she refused, because it was a mark of status to give a dinner invitation, and Cleopatra was, after all, part queen and part goddess. So she got to make the invite, at least in her own mind. Antony obeyed, and came after the invitation. Cleopatra's preparations for dinner were nearly as exhaustive as her preparations for the arrival. Cleopatra prepared 12 banquet rooms. She spread 36 couches with rich textiles. Behind each of them hung purple tapestries, embroidered with glimmering golden threads. She saw to it that her table was set with golden vessels, elaborately crafted and encrusted with gems. Under these circumstances, it seems, too, that she personally rose to the occasion, draping herself in jewels, pearls, gold, lapis lazuli, amethyst, garnet, topaz, everything glittering. On his arrival, Antony gaped at the extraordinary display. Cleopatra smiled modestly. She was certainly wise in one regard concerning the whole affair, by the way. She decided to leave Caesarion at home. Now, at some point, the two, Antony and Cleopatra, would have talked money. That was why Antony needed Cleopatra, of course. She had money, he needed money to fund an expedition against Parthia. Parthia needed to be punished. It was an aggressive power and was at that moment eyeing Syria. Moreover, the Parthians had backed the assassins. Plus, Caesar had planned a Parthian campaign. Antony, as Caesar's heir as he saw himself, needed to carry that out. But probably the most important reason for said campaign was that Antony desperately needed cash to pay his soldiers, and a victorious campaign over wealthy Parthia would be the perfect way to get said cash. And to that end, Antony needed Cleopatra. But both Antony and Cleopatra had similar goals. Those two had arguably lost the most by Caesar's death and his subsequent will. Antony was willing to vouch for Caesar's divinity. Cleopatra benefited from the same. Both, by the way, would benefit from seeing Octavian's ambitions thwarted. Whatever the exact terms of the accord, the two obviously agreed in general, as Cleopatra remained in Tarsus only a few weeks. Now the question is always, were they in love at this point? How much of what comes afterward can we ascribe to romantic desires to be together as much as to political necessity? Certainly, I think we can say that sex was an aspect of the relationship early on. However, it was also politically convenient for the two to fall for each other. Cleopatra was technically subordinate to Antony, since he ruled the East, and she was a client queen. Cleopatra could underwrite Antony's military ambitions. So both had a lot to gain and very little to lose from falling in love. Which side was the greater? Love or politics? I don't think I or anyone can really say. Now that being said, Antony quickly followed Cleopatra south to Egypt in that summer, in spite of the reality that much of the East was still in disarray. This is something that tends to support the argument that he is in love with her, and certainly something that Caesar never would have done. But again, I want to stress, how much of his actions were out of love and how much out of betraying perhaps a deadly character flaw, I can't really say. When Cleopatra left, she no doubt gave Antony a list of demands to be met for the aforementioned cash. He didn't balk at any of them. Certainly one of the first was that her sister Arsinoe had to go. Antony ordered her forcibly removed from the temple at Ephesus and murdered right there on the steps. Cleopatra was now the only remaining sibling. Many contemporary writers were critical of Cleopatra for putting her sister to death. But really, Arsinoe left her very little choice. Her final rebellion made it clear to Cleopatra that so long as Arsinoe lived, her flank was exposed. Together that summer, Antony and Cleopatra toured Egypt, making a survey of the lands. Now, this part was practical. Asia proved to be poorer than anybody in Rome expected. Egypt was still rich. Antony, as I've said about 5,000 times now, needed money. So he needed to know exactly how much money Egypt could provide. Now, either out of deference to Cleopatra or desperate not to make the same mistake that Caesar made in Alexandria, Antony did not bring a military escort to Egypt, but traveled as an ordinary citizen. The Alexandrians dutifully embraced Antony. Choosing his course wisely, Antony had successfully tamed a population that 7 years before met Caesar with booze and slingshots. While Antony remained in Egypt, word arrived that the Parthians were causing trouble and had invaded Syria. Worse still, Antony's wife, and he was married, Fulvia, and his brother had started an actual war with Octavian in the west. Fulvia, we don't know this for sure, but seems to have believed that this might lure Antony back west, away from Cleopatra. It did not. Fulvia was roundly defeated and fled to Greece. Antony left Egypt in April of 36 BCE to face the Parthians. But when word of Fulvia's defeat came, he changed courses and headed to Greece, now needing to sort out this most recent mess. There, he met with delegations, but was ill-inclined to either reproach his wife or break with Octavian. The consensus at the time was that Antony was just too in love with Cleopatra to see straight. I'm not sure that's right, but either way, his refusal to pick a side at this early junction certainly cost him some allies in Rome. Shortly after a stormy meeting with Antony in Greece, Fulvia fell sick and died. Her death opened up a real possibility of lasting reconciliation between Antony and Octavian. And the Roman world desperately needed reconciliation. The son of Pompey the Great, Sextus Pompey, remained alive and continued waging war against Antony and Octavian from the sea. His pirate attacks continuously interrupted the grain shipments to Rome, causing riots over severe food shortages. Adding to this, the Italian countryside was in full revolt. Antony and Octavian, at this point, were little more than petty warlords. Might made right. But the injustice of it all was starting to wear on the system. Hence, several go-betweens stepped in and brought Antony and Octavian together. They signed the Treaty of Brundisium early in October 40 BCE. Under its terms, Antony was obliged to fight the Parthians, while Octavian was supposed to finally deal with Sextus Pompey. The real glue that held the partnership together, however, was Antony's new bride, Octavia, Octavian's beloved half-sister. Conveniently, she had been widowed several months earlier. And so, Antony married Octavia at the end of December in the year 40 BCE. All of this alarmed Cleopatra. It was not in her best interests for Antony and Octavian to ally. The biggest issue for her was Caesarion. At some point, she feared that Octavian might demand that Antony turn the boy over, as Caesarion was the most obvious threat to Octavian, who, by and large, still claimed power through his dead great-uncle. Moreover, Cleopatra was pregnant, and would, by the close of 40, give birth to Antony's twins. Ironically, she likely gave birth right around the time that Antony wed Octavia. Again, so how long would Octavian allow those twins to live? They were plain affronts to his sister and her honor. But all that would have to wait. Throughout the winter of 4039 BCE, the Parthians suddenly swept through Judea and Syria, plundering Jerusalem. Hence, we know nothing of Antony's reaction to the news that he had twins, named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Sadly, we also know nothing of Octavian's reaction to the news, and that probably would have been much more interesting. The fact that Cleopatra now had children by two massively important Roman men would have been a banner headline in 39 BCE. From 40 to 37 BCE, Cleopatra lived like in some Greek drama, though she was often distant from the main events that she only heard about. In 38, Octavia dutifully produced a child, a daughter, rather than the much hoped-for son. That being said, the Roman world greeted the Treaty of Brundisium with a sigh of relief. Cleopatra, though, didn't have any time to relax. Back in the east, the Parthian advance continued. The Parthians wanted to reconstitute the glorious Persian Empire under Darius and Xerxes, and that meant Egypt was squarely on the chopping block. So Cleopatra had the Parthians on one side of her, and Octavian steadily encroaching on the other. While Antony was the celebrated war hero, the sickly Octavian seemed to be able to manipulate him at will, to Cleopatra's continued annoyance. Octavian seemed to be able to do whatever he wanted without consequence. He even managed to leave his wife on the day she gave birth to his child, to marry Livia, who was currently pregnant with her previous husband's child. This marriage moved Octavian into the ranks of the nobility. Octavian, by the way, may have been Caesar's grandnephew, but he did not come from elevated stock. So this just shows Antony steadily followed all the rules. Octavian followed none, and consistently he won. In the spring of 37, Octavian and Antony renewed their peace terms in what has been called the Pact of Tarentum. Antony would now be recognized as dictator in the East through December 33. This was all to ensure that he could finally launch that much-anticipated campaign against the Parthians. Part of the reason for the delay, by the way, was that Octavian was supposed to provide Antony with 20,000 men, which he had not done. Again, no consequences for him for doing that. But then something crucial happened in 37 BCE. We may never know why, but in 37, Antony finally broke. He determined to crush the Parthians, yes, but now to do so in order to finally eliminate Octavian. Maybe he had had enough of the double dealing. Perhaps he was done being lied to. Plutarch, however, offers a different explanation for this reversal. He acknowledges the desire to defeat the Parthians, but he cites as well, quote, "a dire evil which had been slumbering for a long time," end quote. Antony's friends assumed that, over the course of 3.5 years, that the hankering had released its hold, charmed away by Octavia, or at least, quote, again quoting Plutarch here, lulled to rest by better considerations, end quote. In his account, Antony's desire to be with Cleopatra ultimately reignites and bursts into flames. Now, what we have to do here is be really, really, really careful when we think about Plutarch, because he's not just writing a history. Plutarch is writing a morality play, a lesson. Plutarch wanted to get the history right, but he was also making out Antony's life to be a cautionary tale. As a man who was talented, but brought down by his own passions. So to Plutarch, the moral may have been more important than the details. Whatever the circumstances, once Antony arrived in Syria, he defied both his better instincts and cool counsel. He sent a message to Alexandria. Cleopatra was to come and meet him in Antioch, the third greatest city in the Mediterranean world. This time, she set sail immediately. Not long after the couple's arrival in the Syrian capital, coins circulated bearing joint portraits of Antony and Cleopatra. Now, it's unclear who's meant to be on the obverse and who's meant to be on the reverse, which was, in brief, the intermittent riddle of the next 7 tumultuous years. But regardless, the upshot of it was, after 37 BCE, Antony would never see his wife Octavia again. When Antony came east in 37, he first needed to reorganize the eastern half of the Roman Republic. He needed a secure border before he left on campaign, so he appointed kings who he knew he could trust, including both Cleopatra and Herod, king of Judea. Herod had actually been appointed king by the Senate, in part because of Cleopatra. Many in the Senate were worried about what might happen if Antony gave Cleopatra the entire Levant. Placing Herod, of biblical infamy, on the throne in Jerusalem meant that at the very least, there might be two monarchs in the region to offer some sort of balance. Be that as it may, by and large, all the decisions made Cleopatra more essential and more powerful. If Antony were to go east against Parthia, he absolutely could not risk any upheaval in Egypt. Cleopatra was the only person who had proven herself capable of providing that level of stability. So she made her way north to see Antony. Remember, he'd been away now for 3.5 years, and now she felt like she had the upper negotiating hand. And to make sure he remembered what was at stake, she brought the children. Antony was pleased. He had a son now, which even Octavian did not, and would not ever, actually. Plus, through these children, he could establish a divine claim, something he had been keen to do for years. His son would be Pharaoh someday. As soon as Cleopatra returned to his side, her influence over Antony was obvious and would never again dissipate. Antony was busy reorganizing the East, and Cleopatra featured prominently in those plans. In September 37 BCE, he not only acknowledged his children, something Caesar did not do in his will, but he showered gifts upon Cleopatra. He gave Cleopatra control over Cyprus, part of Lebanon, Cyrene, which is modern-day Libya, Cilicia, the eastern coast of Turkey, portions of Crete, and all but 2 cities on the Phoenician coast. As of 37 BCE, Cleopatra now ruled over the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, from Libya to Turkey, with the possible exception of slivers of Judea. She had reconstituted the Ptolemaic Empire in all its glory. Antony did have good reasons for all this beyond love. Cleopatra was skilled at getting ships built, and Antony needed ships. Plus, it could hardly hurt to ally yourself with the richest woman in the world. Even Plutarch had to acknowledge that. Antony needed her to pay for an army and supplement a navy. She didn't need anything. Cleopatra took a moment to bask in all the glory. She announced that her 16th year as queen, 37 BCE, would be year 1 from now in the Egyptian calendar. She even gave herself a new title, Queen Cleopatra, the goddess, the younger, father-loving and fatherland-loving. With the final part of her title, Cleopatra clearly signaled to her subjects that she was first and foremost their pharaoh. In Egypt, her popularity was at an all-time high. The perception among the other client kings in the region was certainly that Antony favored Cleopatra. We can only assume that they resumed their sexual relationship immediately, as she was much more pregnant by 36. In March or April of that year, the couple again said farewell. Antony headed north to prepare for the campaign. Cleopatra turned south to Egypt, taking the overland route so as to tour all of her new possessions. Most of her trip south went well, except in Judea, where Herod reportedly considered having her killed. He didn't. It's not likely that it would have gone well for him. In fact, if anything, Cleopatra probably would have gained much more from his death than he from hers. But regardless, nothing came to pass, and early in the fall, Cleopatra gave birth to her 4th child, her 3rd by Antony. It was another boy who she named Ptolemy Philadelphus. Through 36 BCE, letters from the front streamed into Rome, and Alexandria from the front. Antony, so the letters read, had won us an astounding success after astounding success against the Parthians. Then, Cleopatra received a rather surprising letter. Antony, it said, was back. The campaign was over. He and his army were waiting for her in modern-day Beirut. She was to come at once. Cleopatra's brow must have wrinkled while reading the letter. It had only been a few months. Caesar expected the campaign to last 3 years. How had Antony managed it? Even Alexander the Great took 2 full campaign seasons to conquer Persia, and he's Alexander the Great. Still, she went. Upon arrival, she got the answer. There had been no great string of successes. Sure, Antony had won a few battles at the start, but eventually the Parthians outmaneuvered him. He could not find them when he wanted to seek battle, and when he didn't, the Parthians and their horse archers found him easily enough. Worse still, Antony suffered through a Napoleonic in Russia-style retreat, losing over a third of his army. In only 18 battles, he had lost over 18,000 men. The campaign was equal parts disaster and revealing. Antony was outwitted every step of the way. The Armenian king encouraged Antony to invade Media and then abandoned him. Cleopatra stayed with Antony in his camp for several weeks while he pondered his next steps. Luckily, word quickly reached him that the Parthian and Median kings had quarreled in his absence, and now the Median king was offering a full alliance. Revived, Antony began to plan a fresh campaign. Needing men, Antony asked Octavian for supplies. Recall, Octavian owed 20,000 men and had not delivered. Octavian did send some supplies, but of the 20,000 men he sent only 2,000 hand-picked bodyguards. If Antony accepted them, then he would be agreeing to forfeit the 20,000 he badly needed. Trying to resolve the situation and pry Antony away from Cleopatra, Octavia herself came to Athens, bringing the supplies with a message asking where she should bring them. Antony responded only that she should come no further. Cleopatra had a hand in this decision. She told Antony she would kill herself if he left her. Forced to choose, Antony chose Cleopatra. Octavia returned to Rome, a scorned woman. This was probably the last point at which Antony might have been able to pump the brakes. From 36 BCE on, there is no turning back. Civil war becomes inevitable. It has been said that the 2 greatest commanders in the world plunged the Romans into civil war, quote, the one out of passion for, and the other out of resentment, on behalf of, a woman, end quote. To an extent, I suppose the writer was correct. If there was a the die is cast mentality at any point here, certainly Cleopatra did not feel it. With Antony's affections went the kingdom of Egypt. From now on, the 2 were inseparable. Antony remained in Egypt for the winter, planning another campaign. It is impossible to deny at this point a full-blooded romance between the 2. There are conflicting reports about 35 BCE. Cleopatra may have feigned illness to keep Antony by her side. Certainly what made sense for him at this point was to return to Rome and begin reviving his political fortunes. Octavian still had enemies after all. But he did not, instead remaining with Cleopatra while Octavian crushed Sextus Pompey and finally sidelined old Lepidus once and for all, seizing his 18 legions for good measure. In the spring of 34 BCE, Antony finally marched out with his fresh levies and quickly captured the kingdom of Armenia, avenging his first Parthian disaster. He left most of his army at Alexandria, anticipating a much longer campaign still to come. But for now, he returned to the capital city of Egypt in triumph. That fall, he rode into the city aboard a chariot, his purple cloak streaming behind him. Reaching the podium, Antony mounted one of the 2 golden thrones set there. On the other sat Cleopatra, whom Antony addressed as the new Isis, which must have pleased her immensely. Antony, for his part, dressed as the god Dionysus. Cleopatra was henceforth to be known as the Queen of Kings. Proceeding to his children in turn, Antony went on to ascribe to them great territories. Alexander Helios was to get Armenia, Media, and, once he conquered it, Parthia. Ptolemy was to receive Phoenicia, Syria, Sicilia, and the lands west of the Euphrates. Cleopatra Selene was to provide over Cyrene, modern-day Ethiopia and Libya. And so Antony parceled out the east, though he was not actually in possession of most of it. Cleopatra could not have been but overjoyed. She was protected by Roman legions. She had her children. She ruled over a vast swath of territory, and she became the first foreigner to be featured on a Roman coin, another of Antony's decisions. Together, Antony and Cleopatra seem to have reawakened the old dream of Alexander the Great, the idea of uniting a universal empire combining East and West, Europe and Asia. We will never know how much of the donations of Alexandria, as this whole ceremony would eventually be known, was Cleopatra's idea. Sadly, our Roman sources are so biased that answering that question will likely never be possible. But certainly Antony had to at least agree, no matter how much Cleopatra suggested. He had always been prone to illusions of grandeur, and in that way, the donations were probably just wishful thinking. Nothing less, nothing more. More than anything, this was throwing down the gauntlet. The donations were aimed squarely at Octavian. He might be Julius Caesar's great nephew, but Caesar was dead. Antony and Cleopatra were very much alive, and they ruled a vast Eastern empire far richer than the Roman West. Of course, it is impossible for us now to disentangle what the two may have meant to convey, what Rome actually heard, and what Octavian's propagandists worked to distort. Romans had their objections, to be sure. One did not celebrate Caesar in Alexandria. And was Parthia still not a threat to the East? Was this triumph not a tad bit premature? Whatever his message, Antony meant the donations as an official act. He sent reports of the triumph and the ceremony back to Rome for Senate ratification. Luckily, devoted friends intervened, aware that these dispatches would be read in an unflattering light. To some, Antony appeared theatrical and arrogant, precisely the crimes that had cost Caesar his life. But the biggest problem from Roman perspective was one of roles. If Cleopatra were the queen of all these territories, what was the role, the Senate must have thought, for the Roman commander? Antony had, after all, claimed no territories at all for himself in the donations of Alexandria. To many in the Senate, he looked like he was just distributing Roman lands to a foreigner. News of Thomas Becket's murder shook Europe like a tsunami. Some declared it was the worst atrocity since the crucifixion of Christ. King Henry was hated throughout Christendom, and his reputation never fully recovered. No sooner had Becket's body cooled than he was declared a martyr. By Easter 1171, people were already claiming to have witnessed miracles at his tomb. The king himself, around Christmas 1170, spent several sleepless nights as he waited for some news about the missing 4 knights. Then, on either New Year's Eve or day, messengers arrived and told him about the murder. Henry was almost paralyzed with horror. Quote, "The king burst into loud lamentations and exchanged his royal robes for sackcloth and ashes, behaving more like a friend than the sovereign of the dead man. At times he fell into a stupor, after which he would again utter groans and cries more and more bitter than before. For 3 whole days he remained shut up in his chamber, and would neither take food nor admit anyone to comfort him, until it seemed from excess of his grief that he had determined to contrive his own death. So in consequence, we began to despair of the life of the king, and so by the death of the one we feared in our misery, we might lose both." End quote. For 6 weeks, Henry secluded himself. He refused to attend to any affairs of state or even participate in any recreational activities. He sent word that he would submit to the judgment of the church no matter the consequences. The Pope, obviously, was thunderstruck by the turn of events. He immediately placed all of Henry's domains under interdict, a decision that punished a whole heck of a lot of innocent people, but then he rescinded the order and very quickly behaved much more reasonably toward the remorseful king. He simply forbade Henry from entering any consecrated grounds, so churches, graveyards, etc., until he was absolved. We do not have any information about Eleanor's reaction to Becket's murder. However, by Christmas 1170, and said murder do seem to represent a turning point between Eleanor and Henry. Before then, the two were merely estranged. After then, Eleanor genuinely seems to have despised her husband, and did all that she could to countermand his efforts. In the summer of 1171, the Pope sent 2 delegates to meet Henry and discuss terms for absolution. Afraid they would excommunicate him, Henry fled for Ireland, deciding that this was the perfect moment to subdue the island. The king managed to impose authority over a substantial portion of the island. He also undertook to bring the Irish Church more in line with Rome, a move clearly intended to curry favor with the Pope. In April 1172, Henry returned to England and met with the legates, who were prepared to be reasonable. The king was to do some penance at a later date and renounce any laws detrimental to the church. But that was it. The Archbishop of Rouen then formally declared Henry free of guilt. All in all, an extremely light sentence. Meanwhile, to the south in Aquitaine, a now 15-year-old Richard was formalized as Eleanor's heir and the next duke. This does not mean that Eleanor relinquished any power in 1172, but it did increase Richard's stake in the duchy. Richard, though younger than the young King Henry, was thought to be of sterner stuff than his older brother. Eleanor's second surviving son was quote-unquote tall in stature, his height estimated today at around 6 feet 5 inches. He was thought to be, quote, graceful in figure, his hair between red and auburn, his limbs straight and flexible, his arms rather long and not to be matched for the wielding of the sword, and his long legs suited the rest of his frame, while his appearance was commanding and his manners and habits suitable, end quote. We know that he inherited Henry's piercing blue eyes, but that throughout all in all, he was really his mother's son. He was a child of the South. Languedoc was his native tongue, and he spent almost all of his formative years in Eleanor's domains. He received a very good education, we know, not only in knightly and military skills, but also in the schoolroom, and we know that Duke Richard could read and write in both Latin and in his native tongue. The troubadour culture of the South was an inspiration to him, leading him to compose his own verses. He loved music and loved to sing and conduct the choir. He was a patron of artists and poets as well. Now, interestingly, while Richard is now widely known as the Lion Heart, that was not an epithet that he used or that anyone used around him until a decade after his death. He was undoubtedly Eleanor's favorite child, who referred to him as quote-unquote the Great One, a title I'm sure would go to anyone's head. Still, in time he was to become one of the greatest generals of his age, both feared and respected. Unlike the young king, which is what I refer to Prince Henry from here on out because that's what's in the sources, he was not interested in tournaments, preferring to seek actual martial glory on an actual battlefield. Like all of the Angevins, Richard had a volatile disposition and a savage temper, but he was far more violent and cruel than his father. He could also be ruthless, unscrupulous, and predatory. One chronicler wrote of him, quote, "He was bad to all, worse to his friends, and worst of all to himself," end quote. He was, quote, "impatient of injury. He was impelled irresistibly to vindicate his rights," end quote. Many thought he was proud, reckless, obsessive, even to his own detriment, though at times he could be exceedingly forgiving. While the evidence suggests that Richard was promiscuous in his older years, that's something that could be said of just about every medieval ruler. He never cared for England, but was utterly devoted to Poitou and Aquitaine, which makes it somewhat interesting that he still plays such a dramatic role in the imagination of many English people. I'm sure I'll get complaints about that line, but I'm just the messenger here, folks, and don't possess an actual history PhD. Anyway, we do not know about Eleanor's movements between June and December 1172, but it's likely that she was in Poitou and Aquitaine with her favorite son. Meanwhile, in August of that year, the young king was crowned at Winchester again, this time with his wife, Marguerite of France. From this point on, the two lived together as a married couple. In November, the young king and Marguerite visited Louis VII in Paris. Here, for the first time, Louis begins actively trying to break up the Angevin Empire by turning Henry's sons against him. The young king wanted actual power, and Henry had not given him any. Louis actively listened to the young king's complaints, suggesting perhaps he should do something about it, and agreeing wholeheartedly that the young king was in the right. Perhaps suspecting what Louis was up to, Henry recalled his son to Normandy for Christmas. The family spent a torturous Christmas together. The young king was angry. Eleanor took his side. Henry was irate with both of them. Becket's corpse still haunted Henry's steps. It probably was not the quintessential Christmas carol, Yuletide. With Eleanor and her sons lined up against Henry, Louis waiting in the wings, and any number of disaffected nobles looking for any excuse to rebel, the stage was now set for the most disastrous rebellion of Henry's reign. It is almost certain that there was contact between Eleanor and the French king based on what was going to happen next in 1173. However, because said talks were certainly secret, we have no record from which to draw specifics. One anonymous author wrote, quote, "The authors of this heinous treachery were Louis, King of France, and some say Eleanor, Queen of England," end quote. According to the legends of King Arthur, the great seer Merlin had once foretold, quote, "The cubs shall awake and shall roar loud, and leaving the woods shall seek their prey within the walls of the cities. Among those who shall in their way, they shall make a great carnage, and shall tear out the tongues of the bulls. The necks of them they roar aloud, they shall load with chains, and shall thus renew the times of their forefathers." End quote. These cubs were widely believed to be the sons of Henry II, and in such a mood did they prepare to rise against their father. On February the 21st, 1173, Pope Alexander III formally declared Becket a saint. That same day, Eleanor and Henry began a series of lavish banquets, attended by all their children. Also in attendance was Raymond of Toulouse, who had finally decided to pay homage to Henry. Raymond saw Henry as the lesser of two evils when compared to the young, aggressive French king. During the week of feasting, the young king spoke out publicly for the first time, denouncing Henry's decision to hand over several castles in Normandy to the young Prince John. He also complained that his father Henry had not given him sufficient enough rights to rule his own domains. When Henry refused to change his mind, the young king pointed out that most of the nobles in Normandy, as well as the King Louis, wanted the young king in control. Suddenly, Henry realized that this had become much more than a family squabble. Once the week of feasting was over, Henry made for Normandy. Now, he carted his eldest son with him everywhere he went, assuming the young king remained the heart of all the trouble, and thus not understanding the depth of the issue. Then one morning, Henry woke to find his son gone. He sent riders after the young king, But the younger Henry reached Paris before anyone could stop him. The fact that fresh horses had been left for the young king along the route only belied the reality that this was part of a larger conspiracy. Henry sent messengers to Louis in Paris to return his son, leading to another one of those great medieval Hollywood moments. Upon receiving the message, Louis turned and asked, "Who is it that sends this message to me?" "The King of England," was the puzzled reply of the messenger. Louis turned to the young king. "That is not so," he said. "The King of England is here." Soon afterwards, many of Henry's vassals on both sides of the Channel declared for the young king. William Marshal, however, stuck with King Henry. Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany and Henry's third son, joined his brother in rebellion. While skilled at all the usual knightly arts, Geoffrey never had the flair for leadership that the young king or Richard had. Geoffrey never cared about his brother or his brother's claims. He just wanted to rule Brittany free of his father's interference. One chronicler described Geoffrey as follows, quote, "One of the wisest of men, had he not been so ready to deceive others. His real nature had more of bitter aloes in it than honey. Outwardly, he had a ready flow of words, smoother than oil, and possessed by his supry and persuasive eloquence, was able to corrupt 2 kingdoms with his tongue. He was of tireless endeavor, but a hypocrite in everything, who could never be trusted, and who had a marvelous gift for pretense and dissimulation." End quote. Geoffrey's life would be spent as an ambitious and opportunistic medieval robber baron. England should feel lucky the crown never fell to him. Eleanor threw her lot in with her sons immediately, encouraging her southern vassals to rise up. Henry may already have questioned Eleanor's loyalty, and he might even have had spies at her court. He had the Archbishop of Rouen write to her to remind her of her wifely duties. Quote, "Pious Queen, most illustrious Queen, we all of us deplore and are united in our sorrow that you, a prudent wife, if there ever was one, should have parted from your husband. Once separated from the head, the limb no longer serves it. Still more terrible is the fact that you should have made the fruits of your union with our Lord King rise up against their father. For we know that, unless you return to your husband, you will be the cause of general ruin. Return then, O illustrious Queen, to your husband and our Lord. Before events carry us to a dire conclusion, return with your sons to the husband whom you must obey, and with whom it is your duty to live. Return, lest he mistrust you or your sons. Most surely, we know that he will in every possible way show you his love and grant you the assurance of perfect safety. Bid your sons, we beg you, be obedient and devoted to their father, who for their sakes has undergone so many difficulties, run so many dangers, undertaken so many labors. Either you will return to your husband, or else, by canon law, we shall be compelled and forced to bring the censure of the church to bear upon you. We say this with great reluctance, and shall do it with grief and tears, unless you return to your senses." End quote. Now Eleanor had no intention of returning to Henry, or of abandoning her son's causes, and soon afterwards she was taken captive by Henry's agents and immediately confined in one of his fortresses. Thus began a lengthy period of confinement for Eleanor that was last almost to the end of Henry's reign. The fact is that we know very little about Eleanor over the rest of 1173, and we can't really even say where she was held. No one chided Henry for this decision. Nearly every chronicler condemns Eleanor for her treachery, though a fair percentage of that certainly belongs to plain old misogyny. On Louis's advice, the young king offered lands and income to anyone who would rise with him. By the spring, the rebellion included not only Henry's sons and the King of France, but the Counts of Flanders, Champagne, and Blois as well. Now, I want to say at the outset here that this isn't going to turn into a podcast about Henry II. Our focus needs to be on Eleanor, so I'm only going to give you an overview of the various events that transpire while she's in captivity. In May, the young king, Duke Richard, and the Count of Flanders attacked Normandy, while Geoffrey and Louis hit the Vexin. There were no major pitched battles throughout the conflict. Really, what we're talking about here are sieges and a whole lot of pillaging of the countryside. Normandy was the main theater of the war, but some fighting took place in Anjou as well. For his part, Henry assembled an army of mercenaries and invaded Poitou, Richard's domain. A second army of mercenaries struck at Geoffrey and swiftly ended his Brittany revolt. Throughout the summer of 1173, Henry fought on all fronts. Luckily, both the Church and England continued to support the king. The young king proved no match for his father in terms of talent, which might explain why Henry had not vested the young king with real power in the first place. Henry marched around, playing rebellion whack-a-mole. In September, allies to the young king began suing for peace. Henry sat down with his sons, offering castles and allowances, but still no real power, which they rejected. The only issue of England, by the way, in 1173-74, was an invasion by William the Lion, King of Scots, an invasion swiftly put down by an army of English lords. The sides agreed to a truce over the winter, but in the spring of 1173 everybody was back at it. There was fighting in Normandy and Anjou. Worse still, William the Lion was back, encouraged by the young king. Henry saw all of this as divine retribution, and determined that his next step would be to atone for Becket's death before he fought another battle. In July 1174, he traveled to England, and we know this time Eleanor was with him. It was the first reference to her in over a year in the records. Henry made it once for Canterbury, while Eleanor was sent to be guarded at Winchester. Henry did the required penance at Canterbury. According to reports, over 70 monks took part in the lashing. And as he waited fasting, news arrived that the English had won a decisive victory over the Scots at Alnwick, taking William the Lion captive. The king could not help but see providence in the news. Without Scottish support, what remained of any English rebellion collapsed. The princes now had to sue for peace. By September 1174, all had agreed to new terms. They were basically the same terms Henry offered last year: castles and income, but no power. This time, the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey gladly accepted. While this relationship with the three princes was irrevocably scarred, Henry did forgive his sons. Eleanor was not so fortunate. Henry did not release Eleanor from his custody. For the rest of his life, he kept her under some degree of captivity, nor did he allow her much contact with her children. And once again, I am afraid that this removes Eleanor from our screen temporarily, since, without her husband or any of her sons present, our chroniclers say nothing about her. She was confined, we know that, and likely most of the time at Winchester. If the rolls are any indication during these years, Eleanor lived in luxurious surroundings, but her allowance was a pittance. She was allowed only one personal maid, though I should admit there's no evidence that Eleanor was mistreated or abused. While clearly upset, most of her vassals in Poitou and Aquitaine ultimately transferred their loyalties to Richard without complaint. The poets, however, did mourn her loss. Here's one particularly sorrowful lament. Daughter of Aquitaine, fair, fruitful vine, tell me, eagle with two heads, tell me, where were you when your eaglets, flying from their nest, dared to raise their talons against the king of the north wind? It was you, we learned, who urged them to rise against their father. That is why you have been ravaged from your own country and carried away to a strange land. Your barons have cheated you by their conciliatory words. Your harp has changed into their voice of mourning. Your flute sounds the note of affliction, and your songs are turned into sounds of lamentation." End quote. With Eleanor imprisoned, Henry started living openly with one of his mistresses. Again, the medieval world was not an equitable world. Henry's mistress, in fact, received vastly more of an allowance than his wife. However, there is no evidence that any mistress ever appeared with Henry in Eleanor's place for public occasions. It's likely that the throne that she would have occupied just sat empty. Meanwhile, Duke Richard and Duke Geoffrey were sent off to administer their estates. Richard began an endless series of wars with his vassals that would last the balance of his life. In October, Henry and Louis made peace, and by the spring of 1175, relations between Henry and his eldest son seemed much improved. With his empire at peace and secure for the first time in years, Henry began once more to administer justice and reform his government. Then, in 1175, Henry took the first steps to annul his marriage with Eleanor. His grounds were legally fair. He and Eleanor were closer in blood than Eleanor and Louis had been. But annulment was a drastic step. If the Pope annulled their marriage, Henry would lose any control over her lands and any right to hold her as prisoner. So that summer, Henry asked the Pope to send a legate to hear his case against Eleanor. But when said legate arrived, he only lectured Henry of the risks in proceeding and promptly left England. Henry asked Eleanor to just take the veil and join a nunnery. That would have left him free to remarry and would have allowed him to keep all her lands. Obviously, she refused. This all left Henry with no choice but to appeal directly to the Pope, which he did. In the meantime, the young king was agitating to get out of his father's presence. Henry was clearly wary of this idea given what happened the last time that the young king was alone. But when the young king requested permission to visit St. James of Compostela in Spain on a pilgrimage, his father could hardly say no. He did, however, set severe limits on the young king's allowance. The young king dutifully went to Compostela, but then headed to Poitiers, where he was greeted by several of Duke Richard's vassals. Said vassals showered him with praise, still hoping that the young king might join a new rising in Aquitaine and free them from his brother's iron grasp. He did not. Instead, he, quote, spent the next 3 years in tournaments and profuse expenditure. Laying aside his royal dignity and assuming the character of a knight, he devoted himself to equestrian exercises and carrying the victory in various encounters, spreading his fame on all sides around him. End quote. Back in England, King Henry had taken up with his new and this time far more scandalous affair, this time with the young French princess Alice. Why was this scandalous? Well, first of all, she was a fraction of his age, but more importantly, Alice was betrothed to Richard. When King Louis heard about the affair, he demanded that Richard and Alice be wed immediately, appealing to the Pope to place Henry's lands under interdict until the marriage was complete. Around the same time, Henry started to float the idea that maybe Alice would marry Prince John instead, leading to speculation that Henry might be about to disinherit Richard. By June of 1177, the Pope had rejected Henry's request for an annulment out of hand. Henry does not appear to have made any other efforts to end his marriage with Eleanor, nor did he release her from captivity. In August, Henry rode to Normandy to meet with Louis and hash out the whole Alice situation. Henry made some vague promises that she would marry Richard, who, by the way, had no intention of marrying his father's mistress. And as soon as several mysterious and unnamed legal issues were dealt with, yet the marriage would go forward, no problem. Henry then rode south to inspect Aquitaine and see how Richard was getting on. He returned to England in July of 1178, and at the time, things between him and the young king seemed to be going just fine. In August of the following year, 1179, Henry and Louis visited the shrine at Canterbury to St. Thomas. Both of these men were now in their late 40s. Henry was 48 and in poor health. In fact, just after Louis returned to France in August of 1179, King Louis suffered a massive stroke, and his son, Philip, essentially ruled from this point forward, though Louis continued to live for another year. Philip was a young man, brimming with ambition. He would commit his entire life to destroying the Angevin Empire, and would prove too much ultimately for Henry, Richard, or John to handle. The young king warned Henry of such when he met his father again in England in April 1180. So Henry traveled to the Vexin to renew peace treaties with Philip just before his father passed in September 1180. Said peace terms would not last long. In 1180, Geoffrey at last married Constance of Brittany, making him formally the Duke. Meanwhile, all three of Henry's sons successfully supported Philip in a war against the Duke of Flanders. The fact that all three of them readily sided with the French king in a conflict that only tangentially helped their father was a bad sign of things to come. In March 1182, Henry was back on the continent, inspecting Normandy and Aquitaine. Aquitaine in particular was in rough shape, at least as a result of Richard's rough rule. Most of his vassals were now actively plotting to replace Richard with the young king. Henry ultimately had to return to Normandy and deal with said young king, who once more demanded his father cede him Normandy or Anjou immediately. Henry prevaricated, and in a huff, the young king fled to Paris, where the French king offered him the same sympathetic ear his father had. The young king returned to Rouen to see Henry and made the same demands again. Henry appeased his son this time with more of an allowance and a few more castles, but the clock was ticking. Later that year, Richard began building a castle on lands that eventually would have gone to the young king, who flew into a fury and demanded that Henry tell Richard to stop. If all this sounds oddly familiar to parents of boys and their Lego castles, it should. Richard responded angrily that the young king should rule whatever he has conquered as Richard has. Then, Richard went on and lodged one of the few complaints we have on record to release his mother from captivity. Henry did not. In 1183, things looked like they might break out into open war again. The young king, though he later denied it, actually had a team of archers fire upon Henry and his party at one point, and the king barely escaped with his life. Then fate intervened. In June 1183, the young king fell seriously ill. He requested to see his father, but sensing a trap, Henry did not come. On June 11th, the young king realized he was dying. He made his final confession and included his final request that Henry release Eleanor. Then, that same day, June 11th, 1183, he died. Though titled the young king, Prince Henry had in reality never ruled anything. The king sent a messenger to break the news of her son's death to Eleanor. They found her calm and surprisingly prepared. She had had a dream, she told him, that foretold of the loss. She had seen her son lying on a couch with his hands together as if in prayer, and it struck her that he looked like a tomb effigy. On his finger, she could see a great sapphire ring, the one his father had, unknown to Eleanor, sent to him, and above his white face there hovered 2 crowns. This first one was the one that he had worn at his coronation, but the second was a circlet of pure dazzling light that shone with the incomparable brightness of the Holy Grail. Politically, the young king's death removed the greatest threat to Henry and made Duke Richard the undisputed heir to England, Normandy, Anjou, Poitou, and Aquitaine. In 1183, Henry was 50 years old. He was perennially ill, obese, and bow-legged from all the years in the saddle. Eleanor had now been prisoner for a decade and was 61. According to one source, Thomas Agnell, the years of confinement had made her wiser and more patient. Suddenly, in late summer 1183, Henry summoned her to Normandy. It was not because of some Hollywood change of heart. Henry summoned Eleanor because he needed her. King Philip wanted the lands owned by the deceased young king ceded to his French wife. Henry refused, arguing that Eleanor had only made life lease gifts of those lands, and that they reverted to Eleanor upon the death of the young king. To prove this, he had to bring in Eleanor. So it was that she again sat on a throne by his side. There is no evidence, however, that their personal estrangement had ended. This was a political deal, nothing less, nothing more. Since the previous arrangements between the young king, Richard, and the young Prince John, who was certainly Henry's favorite, no longer applied, Henry also wanted Eleanor to rubber stamp his new distribution of lands. The fact that John was to get a few castles, and maybe Ireland, led to the epithet that would prove super ironic in years to come, by the way, John Lackland. Of Eleanor's last son, I will say this. He's described as unusually lethargic and indolent. He could, at times, display as much energy and vigor as Henry II or Duke Richard, although he disliked war and really didn't care at all for tournaments. He did display an occasional talent and sometimes even brilliance as a military commander, but he was often just too fatally slow to make decisions. Failing that later earned him the nickname John Softsworth. By the way, Prince John and eventually King John gets basically every worse nickname that the English can heap upon them. He was intelligent, he was able, but, just like an Angevin, he was ruthless, restless, and impatient, temperamental, and unable to keep faith with anybody, leading everyone to suspect him all the time. Now, Eleanor may have been a distant mother to John, certainly not by her choice, but the arguments that he was not loved and that led to his personality issues doesn't hold water. Eleanor eventually will make every effort to achieve his peaceful transition to the throne, so suggestions that she didn't love him are perilously weak at best. If anything, John's faults were caused by how much Henry indulged his son. Now here, King Henry really does commit an error of judgment. He summoned Richard, Geoffrey, and John to Normandy to redistribute lands, but how he did so doesn't make any sense. He commanded Richard to cede Anjou and Aquitaine to John, but Richard had spent years fighting in Aquitaine to secure his rule. Giving those lands to John didn't make any sense. So, of course, Richard balked, left incensed, and then sent a message that he by no means was going to cede John anything. Around the same time, Henry told King Philip he intended to marry Alice to John, not Richard. Combined with the new land distribution plan, everyone, Richard most of all, concluded this meant Henry intended to leave everything to John. Ultimately, King Henry's biggest issue was always that he wanted peace with his sons, but only if that peace was on his terms. Eleanor returned to England in early 1184. While there's no record of Eleanor meeting Alice, later events would show that Eleanor had no love for the girl that Henry tried to supplant her with. On the continent, things were falling apart. Angry about the land deals, the brothers began to fight. Geoffrey and John invaded Poitou. Richard plundered Brittany in response. Philip of France probably laughed. In November, Henry demanded that the brothers lay down their arms and come to see him and Eleanor. It would have been the first time the boys had seen their mother in over a decade. This was deliberate, because Henry hoped that Eleanor would help convince the boys that the new land distributions were fair. She would not. When asked to support the new assignation of Aquitaine to John, she refused point blank. Instead, she told Henry that she held Aquitaine not as his vassal, but as Philip's. If Henry wanted to change the arrangement, she would need to ask Philip. So Henry backed down. Then events in the Near East intervened. In far-off Jerusalem, Baldwin IV was dying of leprosy, while Saladin eyed the city greedily. So the Patriarch of Jerusalem sent out to find a new king for the desperate city-state, and they settled on Prince John. John was enthusiastic and begged his father to let him take the crown. But Henry was far too realistic for such delusions of grandeur. He said no, and told John to rule Ireland instead. John did, and promptly made a royal mess of things, alienating both the native Irish and the Anglo-Norman colonists. As we will see, somehow managing to anger everyone on every side of an issue was something of a special talent John had. Back in England, in late April, Henry summoned Richard and Geoffrey to meet with him and Eleanor. He had a new scheme to try and thwart Philip's efforts to pry away his lands, using the dead young king as a bellicose reason. He told Richard the idea was he would cede Anjou and Aquitaine back to his mother. Quote, when they arrived, he sent instructions to his son Richard that he should without delay surrender the whole of Poitou with its appurtenances to his mother, Queen Eleanor, because it was her heritage. And he added that, if Richard in any way delayed to fulfill his command, he was to know for certain that the queen, his mother, would make it her business to ravage the land with a great host. And Richard surrendered all of Poitou to his mother. End quote. How much of this was Eleanor's idea, we can never be certain. But because she didn't speak out against it, I think we can at least suppose she didn't oppose it. After all, she opposed every idea that John would get Aquitaine with full force. Now she agreed. And actually so did Richard, likely because the move made no material change to anyone's circumstances, and nor was it in Richard's interest to have Philip exercise a claim toward Poitou, Anjou, or Aquitaine. In fact, after all the homage swearing was done, it seemed like Richard and Henry were back to getting along well with each other. In the spring of 1186, Henry commanded Richard to deal with Raymond of Toulouse, who was making issues to the south. Richard reportedly grumbled, but he did as he was told. In August, Duke Geoffrey, Henry's third son, died in a jousting accident. His unexpected death led Henry to immediately recall John from Ireland, much to the pleasure of everyone in Ireland, by the way. Henry needed to invest John in Brittany immediately, because it seemed that in the spring of 1187 that Philip was absolutely intent on war, using Alice as an excuse. Henry, Richard, and Philip all met in June and hammered out a truce that lasted about 1 week. Unable to deal with his father's heavy-handed approach any longer, Richard abruptly left his father and allied himself with Philip. The result of this decision would lead to 27 years of war between the Kingdom of France and the Angevin Empire, and would end with the dissolution of the latter. Meanwhile, on the other side of Europe, on July 4th, 1187, Saladin crushed the armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at the Horns of Hattin, and took Jerusalem 3 months later. Christendom was horrified, and the Pope immediately called for a third crusade. Duke Richard immediately took the cross, much to his father's chagrin. He reportedly refused to come out of his room for 4 days when he heard the news. But then Richard hesitated, saying he would only go on crusade if Henry would guarantee his position as heir. Henry refused, likely to keep Richard where he needed him, though Richard interpreted this as an indication that Henry intended to supplant him with John. In January 1188, Philip and Henry agreed to another truce, both seemingly impulsively declaring that they would go on a crusade as well. The truce lasted 3 months this time. On July the 10th, 1188, Henry raised an English Welsh army and sailed across the Channel. It was the last time he would ever see England. Henry was in no physical state to be fighting a major war, but that is what he did. The fighting went back and forth for a time. Henry seemed to have the upper hand over Philip. But then Richard, after returning to his side, deserted him again and demanded that he be given full possession of Anjou and the Maine immediately, plus to be married to Alice, who at this point I'm actually starting to feel bad for. When Henry again refused, Richard, and this time right in front of his father, bent the knee to Philip, swearing him homage for all his lands. Henry drew a sword, and the two almost came to blows. Again, I assume Philip was laughing either internally or just right in everyone's face at this point. There was another Easter truce, and the three men were supposed to meet for more negotiations. About the same stuff that we've been talking about for over a decade now, by the way. But Henry was too ill to attend. Philip and Richard then resumed hostilities, taking Henry's castles one by one, while the old king sat, too sick to do anything about it. Henry attempted to retreat back to Chinon, but sick with blood poisoning, by July the 4th, 1189, he had to stop. On the way, he was forced to rest at the House of Templars at Boulogne, complaining, quote, "My whole body is on fire." When his knights rode ahead to tell Philip that Henry was ill, Richard insisted that he was faking it. On hearing this, Henry, sick and weak, had his men prop him up on his horse and rode on in a thunderstorm all the way to see them. Seeing him looking so unwell, Philip, for pity, offered to have a cloak spread on the ground for him to sit on. But Henry reported stiffly that he didn't come to sit, but to learn the price that he had to pay for peace. He remained on his horse, his men holding on to either side of him. And then he just agreed to whatever Philip demanded. Philip forced Henry to submit to the most humiliating of terms. He had to pay to Philip homage for all his continental domains, agree to leave his lands, including England, to Richard, and order his barons on both sides of the Channel to swear fealty to Richard as his father's heir. He was also to pardon all those who had fought for Richard, and then promise, even though two guys are holding him up in the saddle, to go to crusade and by Lent 1190, a year later. He was to surrender Alice, the perpetual pawn, into Philip's custody and arrange, without delay or excuse, for Richard to marry her, which he didn't want to, after returning from Jerusalem, which he wasn't going to go to. Finally, he was to place it himself wholly at Philip's will and pay an indemnity of 20,000 marks. After all this was said and done, Henry wearily and reluctantly complied. As he drew away from his son, his last words to him on earth were, quote, "God grant that I may not die until I have had a fitting revenge on you." He would not have that revenge. 2 days later, on July the 6th, 1189, King Henry died at Chinon. During the remaining hours of his life, he either slept or lapsed into delirium, moaning with grief and pain. The only person that stayed with him until the very end was another one of his sons, a bastard named Geoffrey. He tried to soothe him and warded off the flies. And in one moment of lucidity, Henry blessed him, declaring he was the only one of his sons who remained true to him. And he was right. When Duke Richard, now the undisputed heir to the Angevin Empire, was told of his father's death, he went to see the body and then accompanied it to Fontainebleau. Henry's tomb is engraved as followed, quote, "I am Henry the king. To me, divers realms were subject. I was duke and count of many provinces. 8 feet of ground is now enough for me, whom many kingdoms failed to satisfy. Who reads these lines, let him reflect upon the narrowness of death, and in my case behold the image of our mortal lot. This scanty tomb doth now suffice, for whom the earth was not enough." While reviled at the time, today Henry II is remembered as one of England's most successful medieval kings. Now, I want to apologize that so little of this episode deals with Eleanor, but I guess that's what happens when you're a woman trapped in a custody in medieval Europe. Thankfully, I can say in most parts of the world that at least has changed, though it's a low bar, I know. Next time, part 4 and the final episode, much more Eleanor. I promise.